Enough. Enough of the imbalance that is causing the degradation of environment, the demise of democracies, and the denigration of ourselves. Enough of the pendulum politics of left and right and paralysis in the political center. We require an unprecedented form of radical renewal. In today's book, our guest offers a new understanding of the root of our current crisis and a strategy for restoring the balance so vital to the survival of our progeny and our planet. It is with great pleasure. I've been waiting for this for a very long time. The GOAT of strategy, the man himself, Henry Mintzberg. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. After that, I'm happy to be here.
It's great to have you with us, man. I tell you what, we have to note the day we're recording on, because talk about irony or serendipity, whatever you want to call it, but this is the day that Mr. Trump has been elected once again as president of America. And when people read this, and I'm going to link to it because Henry also kindly gives away a free copy, but I bought a copy to support it and signed Henry's declaration that's on the website that I'll link to as well, that you will just see the state of affairs that we're in today. And Henry, before we even get stuck into the book, I thought you'd give an overview of this book. And what's so interesting is you're so well known for all the strategy work. And this is probably some of your most important work, but gets least of the limelight, which is why we wanted to focus on it and bring it to a new audience. Over to you.
Yeah, and those words you read on the back were written for 2015 publication, and look what's happened since. As you say, if I write about strategy, I get attention. If I write about this, for obvious reasons, I'm not a political scientist. I don't write for the New York Times, although I have a collection of articles that I might publish one day called "If You Don't Hear From Us in 4 Days," because I've sent so many things to the New York Times with I got as close as getting to know the opinion editor, who started to get interested in maybe doing something, and then he got kicked out because of a scandal in the department. So, I'm still waiting for its day. And maybe Trump will at least serve this book, if nothing else.
You'll see an uplift, a radical uplift in sales. I thought we'd share to understand what you're talking about in this book about rebalancing, or I love the term you use, radical renewal, that we need to explain what you mean by imbalance. I think we all sense it, but maybe from you, from Henry Mintzberg, what the imbalance means at the moment to you.
Yeah, the book is about the imbalance of societies, although now I'm starting to write about the imbalance of ourselves as a consequence of that, and also the imbalance of the globe. But let's start with society. When the Berlin Wall fell, pundits said capitalism had triumphed, and capitalism didn't triumph at all in 1989. Balance triumphed because the Eastern European countries were totally out of balance on the side of government. I see 3 sectors, not 2. So public, private, and what I call plurals. The public sector was dominant in Eastern Europe. The private sector was marginalized by government, and communities were really set upon as a threat to communism. And the U.S. in particular, the liberal democracies in general, but the U.S. in particular, was balanced before then. Before Thatcher and Reagan fixed what wasn't broken, those countries were fairly balanced. The 3 sectors were very strong, and the economies were doing great. And suddenly capitalism had triumphed, and the consequence is that capitalism has triumphed ever since in the liberal democracies and most everywhere else, as another form of imbalance, this time in favor of markets and businesses. And now, with people so fed up, we got a third form of imbalance, which is populism in France, in every country, in Italy, everywhere. And populism is imbalance in favor of the community sector, in effect. So, for example, the imbalance in Turkey or Iran is in favor of religion, which is community group. So what I mean by imbalance, social imbalance, is favoring one sector over the other 2 or 2 sectors, and not the third. And we could talk about personal imbalance too, because that's the new stuff.
I think you were getting there at the end of this book when you point the finger at us. I love this idea. When you point the finger, there's three pointing back to yourself. And the Tolstoy quote, everybody thinks of changing the world, but nobody thinks of changing him or herself. And they came to mind when I was reading the book, and then you cover it at the end of the book. We'll come to that. And even the dilemmas of that it's difficult when you're trying to pay the mortgage and everything's increasing in price, inflation, all these things, the threat of being let go, which you talk about as well, when somebody's let go, so somebody at a higher level can get a bigger dividend from the company, and how
Yeah.
wrong that is. So before we get there, I wanted to share as well, this is not a rant. And you point this out, that you love private enterprise. You actually love it. It's essential. You enjoy the fruits of private enterprise. It's not a rant against that. And maybe you'll share a little bit about that, because I don't want to lose people that we're going to go on a rant for an hour.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's lots of reasons to rant about some of the consequences of private enterprise, but business is great. I mean, I drive a wonderful car. I eat in great restaurants. I benefit in all kinds of ways. Business is critical, but in its place, and its place is the marketplace. I don't want my government growing my cucumbers, and I don't want businesses patrolling my streets instead of policemen or policewomen. So we need to kind of recognize the place of business and in the competitive marketplace, and then it's wonderful. When I bought a car, I had a choice of, I don't know, 20 models of cars or something. No problem with competition, but too much of business ends up being non-competitive, and worse still, ends up using lobbying to distort the marketplace. So that's my gripe.
Absolutely. And I think we're really seeing that. You were so far ahead of the game in many ways to what we're seeing. And it wasn't that it wasn't there then. I think we're just way more cognizant of it now.
Just one thing. A number of Americans were so angry at these vastly rich people manipulating taxes and everything that they have just elected for the second time a vastly rich guy who manipulates taxes. So, they have reason to be angry, but I'm not sure this is going to be the solution to their problems.
One of the things we said when we came on air, and we're trying to avoid talking about this and try to avoid talking about politics. It's very difficult when you talk about business, is the first reaction is the market goes crazily upwards.
Business is delighted, which is worrisome in a way, not for business and not for people who own stock, but it's worrisome.
Let's talk about the origin story of this, which is you go right back and kind of go, well, if you look, America was the land of the free, the land of opportunity, etc., but pretty soon became the land of entitlement, and not for the individual, although many individuals are entitled, but it was the rise of the corporation, and the source of this was corporate personhood.
Right from the beginning, Jefferson warned the country about business trying to take over in 1816, pretty early, 40 years or whatever it is into the new country. Business has always kind of tried to maneuver to have more power. Eventually, the Supreme Court recognized businesses as people in the eyes of the law in terms of benefits, but not in terms of consequences. If a person commits a crime, they go to jail. If a corporation commits a crime and it went to jail, it would have to stop functioning for 6 months or a year or whatever, and would be bankrupt. So corporations get it one way, but not the other. And then the final blow, I think, to all this was the Supreme Court ruling in 2010, Citizens United, that basically threw the floodgates open to private donations in public elections, and essentially Congress is for sale every which way. And look at all the big money that went into this election.
And as you say, imagine that money was put into where it was needed, into community, into giving access to pharmaceuticals to people who really need it.
Yeah, yeah. In Canada, we don't have those large political donations, and we have proper protection, healthcare protection.
I loved what you said about Adam Smith and his invisible hand in America, and the marketplace in America has become what you called the visible claw in American Congress. And you quote throughout the book the words, the prophetic words of Alexis de Tocqueville, who identified the genius of American society as self-interest rightly understood.
Yeah, and now misunderstood, horribly misunderstood. Shocking, eh? All the things that were, but there's always been waves of this kind of thing that's happening now. There was the civil rights movement, there was the mistreatments of blacks well after the civil rights movement. There's always been sort of movements in the United States, quite negative movements. Now, this time, I split. I don't know, we get too much Trump maybe, but this time, the country is split. I think the Trump supporters are split into people who are just plain angry. Maybe they didn't get along with their parents or something. And people who have reason to be angry because they're beleaguered, as you said earlier, paying their mortgages and so on and so forth. And the country is so out of balance that they have reason to be angry. But they have to recognize what the source of that problem is. And that people don't seem able to do. So that's the message of the book, in a way, is there is reason to understand why the country and most of the liberal democracies, the UK equally, are completely out of balance on the side of private sector interests. And community is on the wane, has been for a long time, and government struggles to keep up with all the pressures on it. Business doesn't ask permission, it asks forgiveness, or not even that sometimes. And business and government is supposed to race around trying to correct or regulate what's going on.
That really hit home to me when you said this. So, a way to think about this is you were saying if a business was treated like an actual person and that person is robbing somebody's house, they go to prison. But businesses caught avoiding taxes don't get in trouble because they're too big to fail. And the government themselves will actually struggle from that. And we see that all the time.
Yeah. It's part of the imbalance. And the funny part is this was written in 2015 or so, and it's gotten much, much worse in these 10 years. I mean, I was railing against, maybe not ranting, but railing against what was going on. And what's going on now is far, far worse. Why did the stock market go shooting up today? Because Harris probably would have taxed the corporations more than they did. And the corporations were taxed back in the 70s, and the personal tax in the US hit 90% at one point, which is a bit crazy, but today it's completely reversed. And Trump is talking about getting rid of taxes. And you and I are going to pay because we're going to pay tariffs. Our companies in Ireland and Canada are going to pay tariffs to get into the United States, as if we're not going to counter.
A lot of the audience are from the US and from Canada and Australia, but we've a lot in Europe, Ireland, across Europe as well. A lot actually in the EU countries, particularly listen to the show. And the reason I mentioned that, Henry, is I looked at loads of your talks and you were on a junket talking about this. You traveled around the world and you talked about once you were giving a talk and a Swede stood up and said, "Hey, you're always talking about the US. Surely countries like Sweden are more balanced." And you had you had a different view.
Yeah, I said, your turn will come, which which was also prophetic in a way. I can't remember my exact response, but I think it was, this is coming. And it's come to Sweden, actually. There is a populist movement in Sweden as a consequence. I see populist movements as a consequence of private sector excesses. Private sector goes kind of out of whack and people get angry and elect plural sector people.
There's a concept we always use on the show, and it came from James March and made then popular by Michael Tushman and Charles O'Reilly. And it's this concept of Janus, the image of the Roman god Janus, with a face to the future, face to the back. And the whole idea is this: exploit, explore the future and exploit the present, which is decisions you made in the past. But in the book, I found it interesting that you said some enterprises explore, for example, to come up with innovative products. Others exploit, sometimes constructively, say to bring us lower prices, but other times destructively by squeezing their workers, suppliers, and customers instead of building sustainable relationships with them. A healthy economy, you said, favors the explorers that serve themselves by serving us. And I thought that was just so perfect for this show, because it not only talks to the work you're talking about here, but also one of the problems inside organizations that there's very little investment in the future, because a lot of leaders in organizations are just custodians of the role. They're not interested in planting seeds or planting trees under whose shade they'll never sit.
You know, there's a story I think I'm not sure it's in the book, but I've got it on the website on my blog. A story of a company that starts off enthusiastically, entrepreneurially, and so on. The chief executive is very proud of everything. Then he wants to expand, so he does an IPO and goes on the stock market, and suddenly, so gradually, but not taking very much time, discovers that he's lost control of his business, and everything is about quarterly earnings, and everything's about that, and paying the chief executive obscenely. I mean, we talk obsessively about leadership. What kind of leader accepts to be paid 500 times as much as his or her employees, usually his employees? Well, how can we call that leadership? That's not leadership. They don't even have time to spend that money. That just sends a message out saying I'm that much more important than everybody else. Companies that explore, we love companies that explore. They have new products, and by the way, a lot of them may have done IPOs, but they've kept their voting shares within family trusts, often, as is very common in Denmark and Tata in India, for example, and some American companies too. I think Google maintain shares so they don't have some kid analyst who's got an MBA telling them how to run their business. But once you give up that control to the stock market, it's all about quarterly earnings and paying executives obscenely as if they're solely responsible for performance and so on. And the explorers become exploiters. And that's what we're seeing all over the place now. And people are angry at that too, but they don't see the connection between that, and because they're convinced on one hand that, my company is screwing me, and on the other hand, that business is wonderful and government is terrible, because the economists have made us believe that. And business is wonderful in its place, and government has an important role to play.
One of the challenges, I like this book, it's a brilliant book if you actually read it, if you actually contemplate it. Don't read it quickly, let it marinate. And there's some lines, for example, you say, garbage may be free for me, but it's not free for us. What many of us can afford, our planet cannot. Our micro behaviors are rendering macro destruction. A great line. But when you think about that and you actually see it in your daily practices and go, like here, I have a bottle of water. I shouldn't have a bottle of water. I should have a reusable bottle. I cycle. That was one of my actions I took. I do cycle instead of driving as much as I can. But when it comes to it, when it really, really comes to it, as somebody said to me once, she's a very successful business person. And I asked her about giving and, giving back and stuff like that. And she goes, I'll be Jesus when I'm rich. And that to me was one of those lines that just stuck with me, that's often the way. It's like it's a trophy to be really, really rich. And I get it. There's nothing wrong with wealth. I by the way, I think wealth is great. I think it's really, really good. But it's just when it gets out of balance that's when we see this crazy behavior.
I love this comment. I've never heard that. I'll be Jesus when I'm rich. Some rich people do become Jesus. I think Gates has genuinely tried to do good things. But look at during this election, generally, where the wealthy Americans were covering their rear ends, like Bezos in the New York and the Washington Post, not letting them come out for Trump and so on, covering their asses because they're afraid of what's going to happen. Well, that's not leadership, although there's a lot at stake. So what I say about recycling and things like that is we vote, and we all vote, or, what yesterday says 60, 70% of Americans vote, knowing that their one vote will not make a difference. Okay. No election is determined, or very rarely, by one single vote. So my vote doesn't count. If I don't appear, then nothing will change. But if everybody takes that attitude, you don't have democracy, and therefore we all, or most of us, vote as a responsibility. Well, recycling is the same thing. It's exactly the same as voting. If we don't act individually and we say, what the hell, I'll just throw this away and not worry about it, not worry about recycling it, then if we all do that and we're all doing it, we're finished. We've got three major threats: weather, weapons, and wealth. Wealth is a threat in the sense that even when we're well off, we don't become Jesus. We get greedier. Weapons are three superpowers. I did a blog called Superpower Corrupts and Antagonistic Superpowers Corrupt Absolutely. We live in a crazy, mad world in which three people, three men in particular, have their fingers on the nuclear button, and any one of them could destroy us. Just if they go mad or make a mistake or whatever it is. This is lunacy. This is absolute lunacy. We're fine until it happens, but it could happen as we're talking. That's weapons. And weather, we see what's happening with weather. Not in my backyard, except it's now in your backyard. It's in most everybody's backyard. All I did was lose a tree. So, okay, a big tree didn't come down on the house. A big windstorm came down on the land. So no problem, we chopped it up. But we're all susceptible now.
If you don't get anything out of this show, this quote will etch into your brain, I hope, because it's a lens through which you'll see from now on. Henry quotes this in the book Scotsman Alexander Fraser Tytler, and he said, "The average age of the world's greatest civilizations has been 200 years. Great nations rise and fall. The people go from bondage to spiritual truth, to great courage, from courage to liberty, from liberty to abundance, from abundance to selfishness, from selfishness to complacency, and from complacency to apathy, from apathy to dependence, from dependence back once again to bondage." And that line, when we don't show up for voting, when we don't do our part, if we don't be the change we want to see on an individual level, that's what the quote says to me.
200 years ago, I think it was written. The key year for me was 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell and everybody got the mistaken belief that capitalism had triumphed. And that was 200 years after that quote was written. No, sorry. Yes, I think it was both 200 years after the quote was written, and I think 200 years clearly after the start of the American Republic. It's scary. It's scary, and what's going to get us? Is that going to get us? Is weather going to get us? So my message is we need to be aware of imbalance. And I don't know if you want to get into this necessarily, Aidan, but imbalance of ourselves. Because I conclude we have three basic needs. Maslow talked about needs, and this is sort of similar, but we have the need for consumption to survive and to thrive. We have the need for protection, just to live, just to walk down the street. And we have the need for affiliation, social needs. And each of those needs is satisfied by one of the sectors. So business provides much of our consumption, government provides much of our protection, and communities provide much of our affiliation. And those need to be balanced, but we're losing our affiliations because of the demise of community. As business gets stronger, government gets weaker, and we're losing our protections. A lot of people are angry and vote angry because they feel threatened by the lack of protection. So a country like Canada kind of does it better in a way. The Scandinavian countries even more so. They provide protection. I was amazed in Copenhagen a few years ago when I discovered that somebody working in McDonald's earns about $25 an hour and can live a decent life. I did a quick calculation and concluded that a Big Mac in Manhattan costs $1 more than a Big Mac in Copenhagen. That's not much to pay for democracy.
Well, and it's that stuff that as you said, the boiling frog. We're all in this water. We're all frogs in a way. Let's share a positive one. You say, when we say leadership and we say the word leader, people think of an individual, and that it's not an individual, it's us as well. We have agency, and we actually sit like boiling frogs a lot of the time. We wait. We think people have your best interest in heart. Even on an individual level in organizations, always say to people, there's nobody sitting awake in HR at night going, I wonder, has Henry Mintzberg done enough education so he's okay in his next role or whatever? It's up to you. You have to take the bull by the horns. If there's one regret, Henry and I were chatting before we came on air for way too long. I used up so much of his time. But Henry used to write about rugby. That was in college back in the day, not knowing what it was. I used to play it not knowing what it was, but probably why I got all the concussions. But the reason I share that is one regret I have. Sometimes in a game, you needed to take the bull by the horns. You needed to be the leader. You could actually turn around games, but waited, and it becomes an epidemic across the team. The team is all waiting for the other guy to step up and do something, and you lose the game. And I thought about that. And I was like, going, that came to mind when I was reading this book, that you have to do something. You have to start somewhere. And I loved the story you told about Brazil, that Brazil was written off and Brazilians took charge. They took the bull by the horn and really changed their fate.
Yeah, the Brazil story was about HIV/AIDS, and the fact that they had a sort of escalating incidence of it, and the World Bank thought they'll never be able to deal with it, and they took the bull by the horns. They just dealt with it, and they were aggressive as hell and effective as hell. They just challenged the worldwide patents on the drugs and developed their own versions of those drugs, and they stopped it by themselves. So it's possible to do it. And, the Brazilians have an expression that Brazil is the country of the future and always will be. I don't think that's true. I think Brazil was the country of the present some years ago, and I think will be again, because of the power of community in Brazil, which is startling. Usually, community is powerful in small countries, like the Scandinavian countries or New Zealand, or I don't know where else, Ireland probably too. But in big countries, you don't find that so much, but you do in Brazil. Very, very, very strong sense of community. So I was looking at something about team sport. I'm intrigued. We have a famous hockey team in Montreal called the Montreal Canadiens, who are doing miserably now. Sometimes I'd go to a game and they'd be really with it in the first period, die in the second period, and come back in the or they'll spend a whole game being, is this the same team that just won last 3 days ago? And the chemistry of sport and is I've never seen anything written that explains it well, but there's something, as you say, somebody will grab the leadership and convey it to the others and sort of exude it. But it's amazing how the opposite can also happen. They just die. A whole team just dies. Individual sport is not like that. You're either strong or you're weak, but team sport, very interesting.
It's interesting you say that, because it is an energy. It's an energy that you feel, and even so much so that you'll feel flat. And the questions afterwards, if you lose, will be like, "Oh, did we overtrain this week, etc." But it's an energy, and it's a mental energy. And
Yeah.
what's really interesting, I thought about this as when when you worked in strategy, or you've taught in strategy, you've educated so many people on strategy, and you think about the concept of emergent strategy and how so many times strategy is made in the boardroom that's divorced from actually what's happening on the ground. So they're
Yeah.
so far removed. But actually, what happened, the reason I'm sharing this from a rugby perspective is England, the team England just lost to New Zealand. New Zealand are on this tour at the moment. And they lost in the last minute of the game. They had a kick, they could have won it. But they changed their key playmaker with about 15 minutes to go. Their out half is this key playmaker. And what was really interesting, one of the comments that a pundit made, who is also a key playmaker who plays in that position, he said, "You can't make that change as a coach because only the guy who's playing has an energy and he feels where he is in the game. And it
Yeah.
needs to almost come from him to go, I don't have it today. And then you make the call. But they changed this guy because they wanted him to close the game and they started defending and no longer attacking. And I thought that's absolutely encapsulates what happens in organizations. You have the consultant coming in, making
Yeah.
making a call from the sideline with no feel of what it's like on the playing field.
It's a good way to put it because the way I express the same thought is there are two kinds of experts. Okay, there are those who know better, and there are those who, by knowing better, do worse. Okay, so a surgeon is an expert who really does know better. I don't say cut a little lower, please. Okay, I kind of leave it to the surgeon to decide where he wants to cut or where she wants to cut. But in certain fields, like managers, architects, teachers, knowing better is worse because then you don't play into the expertise of your of your clients. And my daughter just finished a PhD in social work about the role of family in psychiatric care, and she says, everybody's an expert. Everybody has a certain expertise. The guy who sweeps the floor in the factory has an expertise about where the dirt is coming from. And a family has an expertise about how to deal with a family member who needs psychiatric care. Everybody's an expert, and people who think they know better without being on the ground in the field playing the game can do much worse.
I love it, man. I love that. And that's the point, though. You have the sales team, the logistics, the suppliers. They actually they're like tentacles into the marketplace that are
Yeah.
ignored by the higher echelons. There's a concept I think we have to share. We won't do a good job of this book without sharing this. So you say if you fold down the ends of a political line into a circle, and this perspective can take us past two-sided pendulum politics to a three-sector society representing governments, businesses, and communities. This public, private, and plural sector concept is key to this book. And I'm going to share, with your permission, Henry, the diagram so people will see it on the screen. Those people watching us, is it okay to do that?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll share that on the screen so those people watching us on Spotify video and on YouTube, you'll see here, and I'd love you to talk us through this, Henry.
Yeah, this is the key to the whole book, which is that we're stuck with linear politics, which means we swing back and forth between left and right, the way Britain did recently. And that usually leads to paralysis in the center, which I think is the case in Britain. Canada has politics of the center, more or less center left, but Britain doesn't have a center anymore. It's either left or right. France, too, tends to be left or right. And if you only have two sectors, then you often end up that way with this paralysis. But if you recognize three sectors and you recognize community as the third sector, and I call it the plural sector because it's made up of so many different kinds of organizations. We use the term civil society, but we don't quite know what it means very often. I prefer plural sector because there are all these associations, so many, our clubs, our charities, our public universities, which are plural sector community, all our community activities are huge, huge non-government organizations and Greenpeace, and you can go on and on and on. It's a huge sector, and yet we don't recognize it. We don't recognize it's important. We know about government departments, we know about businesses, but we don't recognize communities. So I use the metaphor of a stool, like a bar stool, and you can't sit the bar stool on one leg, whether it's the public sector under communism or the private sector under capitalism or the plural sector under populism. And you can't balance a stool on two legs, say public and private, because you just swing back and forth and you're going to fall over. You need a third leg, and the third leg is community. And the way to achieve rebalancing is through community. If you look at the great social movements like the Reformation in the 15th, 16th century and so on, they started on the ground. Martin Luther was a monk, an obscure monk who just posted something on an obscure church, and his students took it down, used the new social medium of the time, which was the printing press, and believe it or not, 200,000 copies of that page were circulated in a rather short time, and it led to the Reformation. So it's a good example. Same thing, the American Civil Rights Movement. It starts on the ground. It starts with people like that. And if America and lots of other countries are going to come to their senses, it's got to start on the ground. It's got to start with people who recognize what's going on. And that's why I wrote the book. Maybe 10 years later, Aidan, and maybe thanks to this effort, we can do something and get this going. I should mention, by the way, or maybe you will, that there's a site also called rebalancingsociety.org, which carries this forward.
Absolutely. There was a couple of quotes I wanted to share before we finish up. One of them is this. It talks to exactly the thing you're talking about, which is, at its best, civil society is the story of ordinary people living extraordinary lives through their relationship with each other. There's a concept called spaceship Earth. I don't know if you ever heard that concept. I absolutely love that. It was David Deutsch actually who told me about this concept, that we're all hurtling through on a spaceship through the solar system, and none of us are passengers. We're all crew. And I actually think that concept really, really stuck with me. And one of the things I wanted to share was the declaration that you have. This really is a manifesto. I felt this book, and not an annoying one where it's like kind of going, you're broken, you need to fix it. It brings you on a journey to realize and wake up and see lots of things. And you actually say, there is a little bit of waking up to do here. Maybe we'll finish with your call to action on this, Henry, what you want people to do. I have a quote that I'd love to share, maybe to spark your.
Yeah, do that. Yeah.
Okay. To spark your inspiration. I absolutely love this quote. So you said that capitalism was intended to serve us. Why are so many of us now serving it? Or, as Pope Francis said recently, money must serve and not rule. And then there was another one. Will so many of us continue to turn inward, allowing some form of domination to drag us down? Or will we break out of this downward spiral for the sake of a sustainable future? And then finally, I'd never heard about this novel, James Clavell's novel Shogun. A Japanese woman tells her British lover, confused by the strange world into which she had been shipwrecked. It's all so simple, Anjin-san, he said. Just change your concept of the world. And that idea of Max Planck said it best, change what you see and what you see changes. I think that's what we need to do. And that's why I wore this pin, by the way. I try to wear a pin every week to represent the show. Henry, you won't be able to see this, but it just says, start today. So that's my message. Over to you to close today's show.
Well, okay. If you can quote me, I can quote me too. So let me quote from the Declaration of Interdependence. This line is a play on the Declaration of Independence, which is all people are created dependent on each other, our earth, and its climate. And I think that's what we have to, that's the change in our mindset. That's the change in our perception of how we see our world. Thank you, Aidan. This is wonderful. I love this
Beautiful.
conversation.
And this is the book, Rebalancing Society. The website's rebalancingsociety.org. I will link to that. And Henry kindly, along with his B Corp publisher, Bird Kohler, have kindly given away a PDF copy. I've already shared that to my audience on the Innovation Show Substack, but I'll do it again if you haven't read it. It's a brief read as well. There's only 5 chapters. It's written to be very accessible in a world that we're all busy, and it's a must read. We have to take action. Henry Mintzberg, an absolute honor. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Aidan. It was a delight.